Welcome to Solutions Rising. I'm Rachel Branch, and I am so pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Paul Donovan today, an emergency and sports injuries physician who is practicing at the Northern Berkshire Orthopedics, affiliated with Southern Vermont Medical Center in Dartmouth-Hitchcock. Dr. Donovan has an extensive and very impressive background and was a physician at the North Adams Regional Hospital for 27 years. Our program today is centered around the closing of the North Adams Regional Hospital on March 28, 2014. And I'm truly grateful that Dr. Donovan took the time to write a trilogy of the history of the hospital, which is incredible in and of itself, but also incredible as part of North Adams history. Welcome, Dr. Paul.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
And I'm just really delighted that you're here. And the three parts that you wrote on the hospital are just phenomenal. So we could begin, if you would like, and tell just a little bit about yourself, whatever you.
Sure.
This is your show, so whatever you like.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a physician in the area, practicing in Northern Berkshire Orthopedics and Southwestern Vermont Medical Center Orthopedics, and in the emergency department as well. My tenure at North Adams, actually, I moved here in 1989 and joined the hospital staff in 1989, and was an employed physician there, primarily in the emergency department until 2012, when I actually left the employment of the hospital, but maintained my practice there at the hospital at the ambulatory care center adjacent to that. And then in 2012, I spent 2 years at Berkshire Medical Center, and then moved from there to Southwestern Vermont Medical Center, which I'm currently at now.
Did you have foreboding in 2012 that things were coming?
I did. At that point, not to get ahead of ourselves, but at that point the hospital had multiple years of financial difficulty. And that was a concern to me, as it was to a few of the other physicians that were there, and so I thought it was in my best interest and my practice best interest to move on at that point. There was a little bit of disagreement administratively what was going on, and I saw a reduction in services around that time that concerned me, but between you and I never thought the hospital would close. I always thought that there'd overall be a reduction in services there, but the closing really surprised me. And of course, my wife was an RN there, and she worked up until the closing of the hospital, and for not only her, but for all the employees, it was rather devastating. So I was struck by that, because you can't work at an institution for upwards of 25 years and not have a relationship with the employees and the medical staff. And I felt bad for the employees and the community, because the sudden loss of medical services to the community was unbelievable, really. And it just struck me that I felt like I owed it to the community to recognize the history of the hospital over the last 129 years. And that was really the genesis of the book, starting to work on the book and the history of the hospital.
So did you start on the writing of the book before, as it was closing, or right after it was closing?
No, after it was closing, that's when I was really struck by that thought of, the institution needs to be recognized. So shortly thereafter the closing, I convinced myself that it needed to be done. And by the summer of 2014, I started on the project. And it was a 4-year project, basically, that I started in 2014. And it's, as you mentioned, it's a trilogy. There's 3 volumes. The first volume was published in 2016, and that spanned the genesis of the hospital in 1882 to 1910. And then the second volume came out in 2017, which spanned the time frame of 1910 to 1955. And then the last volume came out in 2018, from 1955 to the closing in 2014. And the If you look at the book in total, there's over 800 references. There's over 125 photographs. I interviewed more than 35 to 40 people for the. There's a section in the last volume about employee conversations, and there's a number of graphs and appendices in the book as well. So it was a fairly large undertaking. It took me overall 4 years to complete it, 129 years of history. And I will say that there were a few organizations in town that were instrumental in helping me, like the Historical Society. Sure. Gene and Justina Carlson were very instrumental in helping me. The research department at the North Adams Library was great. And a couple of the employees who had a special interest in history, Paul Hopkins and Dave Blanchette, were instrumental in helping me with photographs and that kind of thing. So it was really a collective accomplishment, and here it is today. So
and just the depth of your research is phenomenal, and putting it all together. Yeah. I mean, I was just stunned. And of course, as we go into each book, we'll go into part one. I'm truly grateful. I never knew. I mean, I knew my family was very involved, but this was a whole community. It wasn't just my Gallup family. And but for me to find out that Harriet Eliza Marsh Gallup, my great-grandmother, was one of the first vice presidents, and then my great-grandfather, she passed away at the age of 31, which was stunning, that he gave the North Wing of the first North Adams Hospital. Those were family treasures for me to find out about, but you know, what you have done, I mean, this 129 years is just incredible that it was sustained, but it was the whole community. Everyone participated. Right. And I didn't know you had balls. I mean, I knew about the Women's Auxiliary. They raised loads of money, and I knew, you know, I would expect
the thing that struck me throughout the whole was not only the volume material that was recorded, because you'd think, oh, the 1800s, they wouldn't have a lot of documentation, and they had an incredible amount of documentation. And the organization of the hospital, when it first started, I thought was incredible. I mean, if you look at the structure of the hospital when it first opened, they had, quote, a board of control, which is 35 women, prominent women in town. They had a hospital president, Mary Williams, who was president for 25 years. I know. From 1885 when the hospital opened until 1910. And she was president. They had 3 vice presidents. They had a secretary, assistant secretary. They had a clerk, and of course they had a treasurer. And then they had several committees. They had monthly meetings. I was able to access the journals on the meetings.
Where did you find those?
At the Historical Society. It was incredible. Goodness. And, you know, it was a little hard reading the journal sometimes, but the information was there. And also the local newspapers, the Hoosick Valley News, and then the Adams Transcript, which later became the North Adams Transcript. Practically 90% of the information was from the newspaper articles, and they had a lot of newspaper articles as well. And I was also struck by the philanthropy, which you mentioned. I mean, you know, it was really a community effort raising the hospital. You know, if you go back to the start of the hospital, as you know, it was this terrible train accident in 1882, where 2 trains collided here on Ashland Street, and the steam engine ruptured, and 35 workers that were headed to go up to the Hoosick Tunnel for maintenance were injured. 8 of those 35 died, 6 that same day, and many succumbed to their injuries. And the community rallied around that accident and said, we need to build our own hospital, because the closest hospital at that time was Pittsfield. And Pittsfield is 25 miles away by, you know, horse and carriage. How long does it take to get there? So immediately a group of townspeople came together, And within days, weeks, they were able to get upwards of $10,000 in donation. They thought they needed $25,000 to build a hospital. They, within the next few months, bought 30 acres of land, which was the Estes parcel farm up off of Liberty Street. That's where the hospital presently is, where it stays. And they purchased that for $3,500, and then the rest is history. Took them 2.5 years to build the hospital, and the hospital finally opened in March of 1885. The original structure was a 12-bed structure, basically 2 wards of 5 beds each with 2 private rooms, and it was a 3-floor structure. It was a beautiful brick and mortar structure. It was fashioned after English cottage type of hospital, and it had all the modern conveniences. It was gas lit, it had steam heat, it had an elevator, and what's interesting when you read is that the townspeople donated furnishings to the hospital. They donated goods and services, so maintenance on the hospital was done voluntarily by some of the craftsmen in town, and instead of, the hospital would also solicit, monies for donations, but if someone couldn't afford a monetary donation, they would often supply goods and services to the hospital. So that was very interesting. And if you look at the progression of the hospital, a nursing school was started in 1891 there, because what they found was that they didn't have enough nurses to take care of the patients, and it was expensive to hire nurses at that time. So they said, we'll start our own nursing school. So nursing school was started. 4 years later, they graduated 4 nurses, and the original school was 2 years, and eventually went to 3 years for additional training. The nursing school was actually affiliated with Mount Sinai in New York City,
Oh, really?
Mass General in Boston, and Yale Hospital in Connecticut. So, again, these are the 1800s. You just don't expect that. I didn't know what the medical history was, but that was somewhat surprising. But they really had it well organized at that point.
And those are top-notch
Yeah,
schools for
exactly.
nursing.
Yeah.
You can't even think, growing up, can't even think of living in a place where you didn't have a hospital.
Right.
It was just
Yeah.
the center, actually, of your community.
Yeah, and the reason for the 3 volumes in part was there was significant milestones along the way for the hospital, and the amount of information was so overwhelming to me that I really needed to compartmentalize for my own sort of thought process. And so the first volume ends at 1910, because at that time there was a major reorganization in the administration of the hospital. To President Williams' credit, she recognized the fact that the hospital was struggling financially even then, because up to 1/3 of the care that they were giving was free care. So she recognized that she didn't, or a lot of the women on the Board of Control didn't have any business background, and she recognized we need to get some businessmen in here so we can educate ourselves on how to manage the hospital, so to speak. So she actually stepped down in 1909 and 1910, and Herbert W. Clark took over. And as you know, he was a prominent businessman at the time. Clark Biscuit, shoe manufacturing. The town of Clarksburg is apparently named after him and his family. And later on, he was known as the North Adams' greatest philanthropist because of the not only him running the hospital, but he donated significant monies to the hospital, added a number of different structures and wings to the hospital. In fact, he donated upwards of over $200,000 to the hospital at that time. And he remained president from 1910 to 1935. He was met with a somewhat untimely death, and then his son, Herbert B. Clark took over in 1935 and was president to 1957. So that's where the second volume ends at 1955, because in 1955, a brand new hospital was built of 119 beds at that point. And then the third volume starts where that stops in 1955 to the closing in 2014. It's interesting from a standpoint of, if you look at the structure of the hospital, it started out with 12 beds in 1885. They did a 25-bed addition in 1891, the Harriet Marsh Gallup edition that you refer to.
My great-grandmother.
Okay, and that Gallup name would always be front and center, because even today, because the Gallups donated quite a bit to the hospital as well. But that addition, Mr. Gallup donated because his wife died at an early age as a complication of some surgery that she had had. And so the hospital was in need of additional beds, and they built that addition of 25 beds to the hospital. A few years later, they added a few surgical and maternity beds. So by 1910, when the first volume finishes, they had upwards of 60 beds. So just in 25 years, they went from 12 beds to 60 beds. So, they tripled, quadrupled the size of the hospital at that point.
And it appears Mrs. Williams and the women on the board were visionary. She certainly was visionary, realizing that they needed business
very much
assistance.
So. Oh yeah, they paid attention to detail. These were full-time jobs, and they were volunteer jobs. They weren't paid positions at all. But I just thought, the organization was incredible at that point.
And I was so glad to see you highlight that, and also the nurses, the women that were.
Right.
It's always wonderful to see women highlighted, and they have not necessarily been highlighted over the years. I wouldn't have known any of that if I had not read your books.
And the hospital wouldn't have survived without the nursing school. And it was actually, it closed down in 1937, unfortunately, but they had graduated over 325 nurses at that point from the program. And the reason it had to close down is because the state of Massachusetts put some fairly onerous regulations in, and the hospital didn't think that they could financially meet those regulations, so the nursing school had to close. But then they quickly, to get around those regulations, opened up a private duty nursing school there. So that was in effect for the next 5 or 6 years.
It seems to, it seems to happen when something good is happening. You throw in a whole bunch of regulations so you can control it, which just diminishes the real value of what is happening. But that's a little side opinion of my own, Dr. Paul. So then when you got to part 2, and you see, what'd you say, 1937, the nursing school closing?
Yep.
This obviously had an effect. Did you have a hard time culling through all the, the history is phenomenal.
Right. At
Did you
times,
do a lot of Post-its on the wall?
At times it was overwhelming. That's why I had to sort of, okay, I want to finish part 1, take a little bit of a break, clear my mind, start on part 2, and then same thing, a little bit of a break, and then move on to part 3. And the second part, again, many milestones in the second part. One of the pretty interesting things I thought was with the start of World War War II, there was significant rationing of not only goods and services, heating oil and surgical instruments, bandages, but there was rationing of nurses and physicians. Several of the physicians from the hospital and several of the nurses were volunteered for the war effort. So there was actually a couple of articles in the transcript around 1942-43 about the hospital may close because they can't get adequate goods and services and they don't have adequate physician and nursing staff. Well, they weathered that storm however they did that. The hospital didn't close. And then they went on, and the end of the war, and the physicians came back, and the nurses came back to practice again. And at that time, the total beds in the hospital was about 100. And the state came in at the end of 1947, 48, and made an assessment of the community and said, you need some additional beds here. 100 beds hospital is not enough for this community. You need 27 additional beds. And that was the start of the thought of, okay, we need to add again onto the hospital, but it's going to be too costly to renovate the existing structure. That's why we need to build a new structure. And the new structure they built was 119 beds. And what's interesting about that is they started a fund drive to raise money for the hospital. And they raised, the hospital was going to cost $1.7 million to build, 119 bed hospital, Y-shaped with an east wing and a west wing. They were able to raise that money in about 11 months. They raised $1.3 million in 11 months. And
this is early 50s?
This is the early 50s,
Yeah.
1952, 53. Yeah. The hospital, once it was built and opened, was completely paid for before it opened.
That's stunning, but I also think that speaks to the community and the business leaders and the,
absolutely.
The whole
right.
priority that the hospital continued to have.
Yeah, and you know, yearly the hospital would solicit donations from townspeople, from businesses. There was even a weekly collection at the churches for the hospital when the hospitals first started out. So yeah, the amount of philanthropy was incredible. The community just really supported the hospital.
So now, as we're winding down some, we need to go to the closing, the sad closing of what happened.
Yeah. So 1955, new hospital. As we get into the 60s and 70s, that was really sort of the heyday, the positive part of the hospital. In 1970, the north wing was added, which is an additional 80 beds. So in 1970 and the few years after that, there was a total of 200 beds at that hospital with more than 850 employees. And so in the 70s and early 80s, as we get to the 90s, there's an emphasis on ratcheting down on the number of inpatient beds, and the emphasis is on outpatient procedures. So in the early 90s, there were cutbacks of, layoffs, ratcheting down with the number of beds from 200 to less than 100 beds. Again, with the emphasis on outpatient surgeries, outpatient treatment, how can we get these patients in and out of the hospital quicker type of thing.
Is that the beginning of the diminishment?
It was. And it was the beginning of the financial stress on the hospital, so to speak, where the hospital is always given a certain amount of free care. And that free care seemed to be buoyed by the fact that there were adequate donations at the end of the year to help support that. Well, the quote payer mix, you've heard this before probably. They always cite the payer mix. About 70-75% of the patients that go to the hospital are Medicare and Medicaid. And from an economic standpoint, those programs don't reimburse the hospital a dollar for a dollar. They under-reimburse the hospital.
Which I think is a systemic structural problem
in
taking care of hospitals.
Absolutely. So you have that fact coupled with free care, and so the hospital needs a mechanism of catching up, but it was harder to catch up as the years went on, and the hospital underwent significant, consistent losses in the 90s and 2000s. And eventually that just became unsustainable. And one of those large sustainable losses was they purchased Sweetbrook and Sweetwood in 1999 for roughly $20 million. Actually, it was $19.9 million. And then they sold both structures in 2010 for $6 million. So that was a $13 million loss for a non-hospital related service. So the debt kept piling up,
And from my perspective, investing outside of the hospital just was not acceptable. That's my own personal opinion,
Right.
and I think other people too. Like the
Yeah,
accent should have been on the hospital,
Right.
and fighting for the structural changes that needed
Yeah,
from our government and those who are accrediting hospitals and supporting them.
Yeah, realizing too, in 1997, the Balanced Budget Act of the federal government cut upwards of about $7 million from reimbursement to the hospital over 5 years. So in the midst of underfunding Medicare and Medicaid, in the midst of significant amount of free care, in the midst of these other investments that weren't particularly profitable, that the financial debt kept increasing, and then it became unsustainable. And of course, again, I left around 2012, so I wasn't privy to a lot of discussions that went on after that. As president of the medical staff for 2 years, I sat on the board, so I knew exactly what was going on at the board level, but then I left. But as you know, a short announcement in terms of closure, and 3 days later, the doors were closed for the hospital.
Which was illegal. It was supposed to be a 90-day notice,
Right,
and
right.
there's a lot of ramifications of that.
Yeah.
We are coming to the end, Dr. Paul. Would you like some final thoughts? I'm just really grateful that you're here.
Yeah, just that I think that Berkshire Health Systems that subsequently purchased the facility, as you know, and set up in place additional services, the ER, dialysis, physical therapy. These are all outpatient services. They're all very much needed. You know, when Stroudwater came in from Maine and made that review of the care,
Yes.
they recommended some inpatient beds and behavioral health beds, and I agree with that. I will say that from a practical standpoint, the economics just don't support that, and that's not justification for having no inpatient beds, but it is. I mean, because it's a more systemic, global problem, as you mentioned, about reimbursement and that. So
Yes.
I think that, to Berkshire's credit, they're doing as best as they can do. Would it be nice to have inpatient care for medical patients and psychiatric behavioral health? Absolutely. But again, who's going to pay for that? And
Well, of course, then that comes to what could have been done to save the hospital.
Correct.
And that's part of this series of programs that we're doing. Thank you so much. And if each one of us pick up one problem and solve it, imagine the incredible view we will all have of solutions rising. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul Donovan.
thank you very much for having
I'm
me here.
really
It was a thrill.
So appreciative.
Sure.